All right, so we are now going to listen to Matthew McNee.
Hello, I'm Matthew McNee. Thanks for having me. Today, I'm going to share my experience managing the interface in Western Australia and the Falkland Islands. I'm going to start today with some examples of digitally enabled OFE that I've been involved with in broadacre cereals and also rangeland sheep. And then I'm going to move on to the common challenges of working at the interface. So, three brief examples of digitally enabled OFE at very large scale and in vastly different farming systems. This first example is an interesting one because the farmer actually undertook this experiment because he saw the results of a small plot experiment nearby. And what he wanted to do was extrapolate the findings at scales which were meaningful to him. And so we supported him to monitor grain yield in his canola at the scale that you can see there. In our second example here, in the Falkland Islands, we were looking at soil acidity. And there's been lots of experiments in the Falkland Islands that have investigated how pastures respond to liming and other products like calcified seaweed. However, what we found in the OFE process was that what the farmer was really interested in was how lime would affect the grazing behaviour of his livestock on those amended soils. And so we supported the farmer here by providing an experimental design and also providing them with GPS collar technology so that he could observe the changes which occurred. In my third example here of OFE, we're really talking about the engagement phase of the OFE process, which is very important. The reality is that OFE does not begin when an experiment begins. It is part of a process. The experiment is actually part of a process. And so the engagement phase is really the first bit which develops the experiment. It develops questions, in this case, about use selection. It helps us to see what tools might be needed practically for the farmer to undertake experiments. And it allows us to bring in other resources like our digital soil maps and mapping tools so that they can understand what variation might impact the results. And these are the sort of lead up activities which result in the experiment. Now I'm going to move on to the challenges at the interface. So what is managing the interface? Well, it's really about bridging the interests of farmers, science, industry and government. And when we do this, usually we're standing up alone to farmers, government, funding bodies, corporate sponsors, the private sector, civil society groups and scientists. There are multiple jobs that need to be performed at the interface, and often they need to be performed simultaneously. For example, we need to communicate the importance of the research, support the farmer to communicate their interest, report results in industry and science and scientists friendly ways. We also need to encourage others to explore and adopt, convince funders, attract more resources, advertise membership for the local farming group, and satisfy corporate sponsors. And that last one can be really important in digitally enabled OFE, where we're introducing new technologies. Affecting the outcomes of an already difficult balancing act are a number of factors, which we call the first order problems. The first is the crowd. There is lots of eyes and lots of possible faux pas at many levels. Then there is the peer pressure. People are vulnerable to the loud voices. They're also vulnerable to absent voices. We can't hear people if they're not present. And then there are the group dynamics. People come together for diverse reasons, and we're often not aware of what those are when we're working at the interface. So then there is those occasions where we've all been in them, where there's some questionable legitimacy and intentions amongst some members of the crowd. And that often manifests itself in things like a vested interest promoted with emotive discourse, which seems to take over everything that you're talking about. And then there is the theoretical tragedy. And this is where powerfully held beliefs or popular reasoning comes about without a theoretical background or data to support it. OFE deals with these issues inherently because it focuses on the individual. It does this because we're able to focus more acutely on the pains in people's jobs, the gains that they aspire to, and the demands for change that are impacting them today. So, a first call to action is scaling out OFE. We need more OFEs. But what about these other skills that are required at the interface that perhaps OFE doesn't deal with as well? How do we encourage? How do we convince? How do we advertise? How do we satisfy? The type of skills that I'm talking about here that relate to these things are things like identifying indicators that work, working iteratively, identifying farmer buy-in and entry points, developing the local ecosystem, and strategic thinking. Now, whilst there are networks of extension that provide training, there is no dedicated training that I'm aware of or that has been part of my career that will speed up the sort of skill development that I've just spoken about. There is no dedicated training for access support and guidance networks. There is no dedicated training to access or contribute to relevant expertise networks. And the sort of jobs that I've talked about, there is no clear name for them collectively, and that means that there is a lack of recognition. In agronomy, there is generally also a lack of discussion about the challenges which I've told you about here today. And these are what I call the second order problems that we must address through OFE. So a second call to action is scaling up, and that means growing OFE or OFE engineering. Why don't we have a discussion about an internationally recognised accreditation for people working at the interface that gives them the tools or the means to be effective? It provides the incentive to choose this rewarding path, and it also provides those who are already engaged in this, gives them the recognition that they need to keep going. In conjunction with this, we also need a space where our learnings are collected, a space to record and reference, a space to discuss critically. A lot of this resides in the grey literature and never makes it into agronomic publications. And so what we see here is a journal that is going to help progress the process. It's going to improve the science of OFE implementation. The second call for action is essentially about creating value by giving people meaningful work in the world of knowledge creation. It is about mainstreaming innovation brokers as a recognised pathway to PhD graduates. Thank you for your attention today, and I really look forward to the outcomes of the conference.